An entertaining episode that also makes an important point. What show is this? This is a review of the Star Trek Voyager episode, Living Witness. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know why Chakotay expanded his tattoo, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. The choices for which Voyager episodes to review in this batch seemed arbitrary when I made them. I tried to avoid episodes that I knew I wanted to include in future batches, but other than that, I kind of just picked some episodes. But now I'm starting to pick up on some patterns I wasn't aware of before. This batch has a few Doctor shows and a few shows where the writers get creative in order to avoid having to write a typical Voyager episode, and a few that are both of those at once, like the previous episode I reviewed, and like this one. We open with Captain Janeway conducting a negotiation with some alien dude, Daleth, who is requesting Voyager's assistance in a conflict his people are having against another alien race, the Kyrians. Daleth wants Janeway to capture the leader of the Kyrians, and in return, he will give them the coordinates of a nearby wormhole that will help them cut short their journey home. Janeway agrees. Is there something different about her? I can't quite put my finger on it, but I know there's... Oh, I see it. She's not wearing her comm badge. Wow, what an embarrassing production goof. The action moves to the bridge, where there are other changes to the typical look of the characters. There's a Kazon crew member. Neelix is wearing a uniform and working the tactical station. Chakotay's tattoo is spread to cover that whole half of his face. And also, they're pronouncing his name Chakotay now, with the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Kyrian ships attack Voyager, so Janeway says, I have an idea to flush out their leader. Let's deploy biological weapons against their civilian population. Daleth, who got Voyager involved in this to begin with, starts to have second thoughts. He's like, hey, I only wanted to capture their leader. I didn't say anything about killing civilians. Come on. Janeway's like, don't puss out on me now, Snakeface, and gives the order to fire on the Kyrian cities. The Doctor, who is suddenly an android instead of a hologram, modifies the phasers to carry the biological agent, and Voyager starts bombarding the planet from orbit. Then everything freezes, and the other shoe drops, and it turns out everything we've seen so far has just been a simulation in a museum. We meet this guy, Quarren, who is a Kyrian, and who runs this Voyager exhibit. It turns out it's 700 years after Voyager visited the planet, and there was a great war between the Kyrians and Daleth's people, the Vaskans, and because of that, records from the era of Voyager's visit are incomplete, so this recreation is the best they could do to piece together what actually happened. The Vaskans won the war, apparently, and the Kyrians have been an oppressed minority in their society ever since. Anyway, back to the simulation. Daleth is feeling really bad about asking for Janeway's help because now they're doing a genocide against the Kyrians. Janeway's like, you ask for my help and now you complain about how I decide to help you? Get lost, loser. And she has Daleth dragged off to the brig. Then Janeway's like, hey, Tuvok, you and me are fucking in this version of history, right? And Tuvok's like, we fully are. Meanwhile, Chakotay and Harry Kim are trying and failing to beat some information out of a Kyrian prisoner. He refuses to give up the location of their leader, Tedran. Then the Doctor walks in and says, let's just dissolve his brain. So they dissolve the guy's brain, but before the brain dissolves all the way, he tells them the location of Tedran. That was nice of him. Some Kyrians manage to board Voyager, so Janeway deploys her Borg strike force, led by a still Borgified 7 of 9, to subdue them. Then they capture Tedran and his, I don't know who she's supposed to be, his lady friend, and bring them to the mess hall. Janeway says, surrender or I'll kill you. Tedran says no, so Janeway grabs a phaser rifle and kills them both. Then she turns to Daleth, who is standing nearby, and says, don't you even give me that look, and walks out. Back in the museum, Quarren's like, yep, pretty fucked up, right? Anyway, the war was devastating to our people, and our struggle for equality continues to this very day. Feel free to explore the rest of the exhibit, and let me know if you have any questions. This one Vascan guy walks up like, yeah, I got a question. How can you even prove that any of this so-called history is true? And why are you people always trying to blame your problems on us, huh? Hey, look, I got no problem with you pimple faces. Some of my best friends are Kyrians, but I don't like seeing my people made out to be the villains in your history. And I don't want your history taught to my children. And also, I don't like you moving into our neighborhoods and lowering the property values. And what else? Oh, yeah, stop protesting whenever one of our cops kills one of you. It slows down traffic. Okay, I think that's it. Quarren tells this guy that he'd better get used to having to learn Kyrian history because it just so happens they've recently recovered an artifact that has been confirmed as originating with Voyager itself. And as soon as they study it and figure out how to access its data, they'll know a whole lot more about what happened when Voyager got involved in the war between the Vaskins and the Kyrians. Later, Quarren is inside the simulation of Voyager's engine room working on that artifact. It turns out it contains a program of some kind, and when Quarren is able to run the program, he discovers to his amazement that it's the Doctor. They're both a little confused initially. Quarren thought the Doctor was an android, not a hologram, and the Doctor expected to still be on Voyager, not a simulation of Voyager 700 years in the future. But after a few minutes, they managed to work all that out. This version of the Doctor is a backup version that was stolen from Voyager during the Kyrian attack and must have somehow wound up buried on the planet. Also, since the Kyrians have always believed the Doctor is a war criminal who designed a biological weapon that killed millions of people, he's probably going to be in a lot of trouble now. The Doctor's like, wait, what? War criminal? Voyager committing genocide? That's largely incorrect. In fact, you've gotten a lot of the facts wrong in your exhibit. Quarren, who is wary of the Doctor given the history he's always known, but is also genuinely interested in what actually happened, shows the Doctor the entire simulation of Voyager's interaction with the Kyrians and the Vaskins. The Doctor objects to how inaccurate the simulation is, and at first Quarren rejects the Doctor as a liar. But then he comes around and agrees to allow the Doctor to create his own simulation, telling the story as he remembers it. So the Doctor does that, and we get to see his simulation, and the uniforms and hairstyles are as we usually see them, and the kinky sexual tension between Janeway and Tuvok is gone, and in this version, Janeway is simply looking to swap medical supplies for dilithium with the Vaskins when the Kyrians attack, board Voyager, kill a few crew members, and take 7 of 9 as a hostage. Tedrin leads the attack, which ends in a confrontation in the mess hall where Tedrin is distracted, 7 disarms him, then Daleth pulls a gun and shoots and kills Tedrin. In this version, the Voyager crew comes out a lot better, and pretty much everyone else comes out a lot worse. The Kyrians are the aggressors rather than the victims, and Daleth exhibits some blatant and vicious prejudice against the Kyrians and ultimately kills Tedrin after the standoff had already been resolved. When the simulation ends, the Doctor explains that after this happened, the Kyrians continued attacking Voyager, and it was sometime after that his backup module was taken, and that's all he remembers. The team of arbiters, the officials responsible for deciding whether to charge the Doctor with war crimes, is split in their reactions to the Doctor's version of events. A Vaskin arbiter is sympathetic since it presents the Kyrians as the ones who attacked first, but a Kyrian arbiter is less convinced and accuses the Doctor of making up this story to avoid being held accountable for his crimes. The Doctor insists that he can prove his version is true. One of the artifacts from Voyager displayed in the museum is a tricorder the Doctor used to scan Tedrin after he was shot. If that tricorder can be reactivated, it would contain data proving that Tedrin was shot by a Vaskin weapon, not by Captain Janeway's phaser. The Kyrian arbiter doesn't really care. She points out that no matter what happened or didn't happen 700 years ago, her people are still an oppressed minority in this society right now. My children can't go to the same schools as your children, she tells the Vaskin arbiter. My people aren't allowed to live in the city center. Hell, I'm only on this committee because you needed a token Kyrian. You Vaskins will make the final decision because you always do what you have to do in order to keep yourselves in power. The Doctor and Quarren get permission to try and extract the data from the old tricorder, but as they're working on it, the museum comes under attack. A mob of Vaskins has heard that the museum is full of Kyrian lies, and they've come to trash the place, And they do. Later, when the mob has left and the museum is in ruins, the Doctor and Quarren can still hear the sounds of fighting outside. The Doctor feels guilty for causing this, but Quarren tells him that the tensions between Vaskins and Kyrians have been building for a long time, and something was bound to set them off sooner or later. Quarren tells the Doctor that their best option is still to get that old tricorder working, but the Doctor has another suggestion. Delete his program. If he's gone, then maybe the conflict over his version of history and what to do with him will subside. Who am I to suddenly show up and tell you that your history is wrong? The Doctor asks. It's all open to interpretation anyway. Who's to say the version I remember is what really happened? And what does it really matter now, 700 years later anyway? It matters because we keep blaming each other for what happened in the past, Quarren says. If you don't help us understand what really happened now, this conflict could last for another 700 years. The Doctor is convinced and agrees to help Quarren get the facts off of the tricorder. And then we see that this has been another simulation, being watched by another group of people at another museum even further into the future. The guide at this museum explains that the Doctor's testimony was a turning point in history, and that from then on, the Kyrian and Vaskin people started to become more open and respectful of each other, eventually learning to live in harmony. The Doctor remained on the planet for many years, but then one day left on a small ship, saying that he had a longing for home. And then we pull back to reveal that this is yet another simulation being played for the disciples of the Doctor, who returned to this planet many years later with a conquering army and brought death and destruction to all those who dared question his integrity or impugn the character of his friends on Voyager. No, okay, that didn't happen. The one right before that, where the Doctor left for home, was the end. I like this episode a lot. In terms of plot and character, it's pretty straightforward and unremarkable, but it has something to say that was relevant back in the late 1990s when it originally aired and feels more relevant than ever right now. At first, it seems like we're in for another silly, everybody gets to play their characters out of character show. We get the dark Voyager scenes with a version of Janeway who is murderous, well, more overtly murderous than usual, and Voyager itself reimagined as a warship rather than a ship of exploration. And it is silly, and it is fun, though fittingly, these dark versions of the Voyager crew are still pretty bland, pervy vibes between Tuvok and Janeway aside. But beneath the surface of that goofy conceit are a couple of very sharp observations about these characters, about Star Trek, and about how we define ourselves and each other. The first observation, which I'll only mention briefly because it's in the episode but not really what the episode is about, is how different the actions of Voyager look from the perspective of someone who isn't on the ship. Star Trek shows always tell their stories from the point of view of the captain and the crew. Nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting to imagine how their actions look to the people living on these planets they visit. Captain Janeway sees her stopover at this planet as an opportunity to trade for some items that will make their journey a little easier and doesn't intend to get involved in any internal political matters. But to the Kyrians, this looks like Voyager conspiring with their enemies, the Vaskins, and immediately puts Voyager in a villainous light. Give that 7 centuries to marinate and throw in the complication of incomplete records surviving from that era, and it's easy to see why the Kyrians come to view Voyager the way that they do. Makes you wonder how many other planets take a similar view of the actions of the Starfleet crews who briefly got mixed up in their internal affairs as they were passing through. The other observation, and the one around which the episode is structured, is the uncomfortable truth that we never know as much about our history as we think we do. Our sense of identity, both as individuals and culturally, is so deeply rooted in the past, in who we were, who we have been, how far we've come through the years, and yet, the further back into history we go, the more time that passes between then and now, the less we know about then. But at the same time, the further back we go, the more important we tend to regard the events in history as being. From Quarren's perspective, the events on Voyager we see depicted here took place 700 years ago. They could hardly be more significant. They set the course for the evolution of his society for centuries. The ramifications of those events are still being dealt with. Quarren, as a scholar, is aware intellectually that he doesn't have the full picture, that his simulation probably has some inaccuracies here and there, but he believes that his understanding of this history is largely accurate. There are differing opinions about that history. This racist Vascan asshole thinks the museum exhibit paints his people in an unfair light. The Kyrian woman on the arbitration committee thinks the doctor's version is self-serving and only serves to erase the injustices committed against her people, but everyone thinks they know. And what everyone thinks they know, whatever it is unavoidably shaped by their own biases and interests. The truest moment in this episode is when Quarren rejects the doctor's story, when he deactivates the doctor and calls what he was saying lies. Whether we admit it or not, that's how most of us would react to having our narrative challenged too. We know what we know, and how dare anyone else try to tell us something that contradicts that? We become so attached to the version of the story we know that we get downright hostile when someone else offers up an alternate version, even if that alternate version might be closer to the facts. We choose the map over the territory. We're seeing how corrosive this kind of thinking can be right now in the United States, as the Trump administration attempts to sandblast anything offensive to far-right Christian conservatives from the tellings of our history. Anything about people of color, queer people, indigenous people, anything that upsets the narrative that America was founded and built up by noble Christian cis-hetero men is being, in some cases literally, ripped off of the wall. I'm sure this guy would approve. The current state of affairs in the United States, and much of the rest of the world as well, is what happens when you elect a whole bunch of this guy to run the show. But the thing is, it's not just right-wing zealots who do this. We all do it. And we're all vulnerable to choosing our preferred narrative over the facts. That's why the most optimistic moment of the episode is the one that follows Quarren shutting off the doctor's program, when he thinks over what the doctor has told him, leaves open the possibility that the doctor is telling the truth, and reactivates his program to hear him out. Quarren reacts defensively, feels compelled to protect the version of history he has believed in, the version of history he has built his museum exhibit around, but his commitment to the truth is finally what guides him. Like I said, when it comes to history, especially history that occurred decades or centuries in the past, we can never know exactly what the truth is. All history will always be incomplete, and all history will always be influenced by the subjective interpretation of whoever is researching and telling the story. There's no way around that. But we can at least make the truth the thing we are striving for. We can be open to new facts, new discoveries, and new interpretations that will challenge our preconceptions and change our understanding of what happened in the past and what it meant. That's what Quarren does. He chooses the truth, or at least the effort to find the truth, over the narrative that he now knows doesn't represent what really happened. When the riots break out, the doctor says, "Forget what I've said, deactivate me, go back to telling the story everyone knew for the sake of peace." And Quarren rejects that. He says, no, the truth matters. If we're going to allow our past to determine how we treat each other in the present, then we should at least try our best to know what really happened. It's a brave and noble thing. And as is usually the case in real life, the presumably more accurate version of history offered by the doctor is a lot more complicated than the story Quarren has been telling in his museum, or the version the Vaskans seem to want to tell. In the doctor's rendering, the Kyrians are no longer passive victims of Vascan aggression, but a violent resistance movement that attacks Voyager merely for having a Vascan official aboard. and the Vaskins, represented in the simulations by Daleth, come across as less scheming and opportunistic, but remain condescendingly racist against the Kyrians. At one point in the Doctor's simulation, Daleth characterizes all Kyrians as devious, and then, at the end, he straight up murders Tedrin. The truth isn't terribly flattering to anyone, except the crew of Voyager, of course, who can do no wrong. Can I be charitable and chalk that up to the Doctor's own biases instead of lazy writing? Crucially, the Doctor's version of history doesn't serve to simply reverse the roles of the Vaskins and the Kyrians in the present. It's not that the Kyrians were the bad guys all along. They were more aggressive in the incident with Voyager than as depicted in Quarren's simulation, but that doesn't excuse the oppression under which they struggle today. The social order, with the Vaskins dominating the Kyrians and treating them as an underclass, still exists and is still unjust, regardless of whether Tedrin was a passive martyr or a violent rebel. Voyager didn't go in for obvious social and political commentary quite as often as TOS, TNG, or Deep Space Nine, but when it did, it had a tendency to swing for the fences. Such is the case here. The themes about how unreliable and contingent our understanding of history is, the ways in which bias and personal interest can influence our telling of history, the obvious metaphor for white supremacy, and how white-dominated institutions attempt to downplay or erase black history, as well as the history of other minority groups, it's all presented without apology, without flinching. One of the things Star Trek was created to do is to use science fiction to tell the audience uncomfortable truths about themselves, their society, their beliefs. I'm not sure if Voyager ever does that more powerfully than it does in this episode. So yeah, like I said, this is a good one. I like it a lot. As is the case with other Voyager episodes, the fact that it's so good also calls my attention to how underwhelming the series usually is. And, as others have pointed out, isn't it telling how this episode, one of the best of the series, features none of the actual regular characters? Even the Doctor, who is essentially himself, as we see him throughout the rest of the show, is technically a backup version. Same character, same personality, same experiences up to the point when this episode begins, but not precisely the same guy. What does it say about the quality of the characterization on Voyager that the writers were so eager to write about other people and had so much success when they did so? Again, that's a comment directed at the series as a whole. It doesn't reflect poorly on this episode. The gimmick of showing us more villainous versions of the Voyager crew is somewhat diluted by how nondescript the characters are in their typical forms, but it's still fun to see Janeway casually ordering a mass murder and executing prisoners as though it's just another day at the office. And the use of the Doctor in the episode is a very clever way to have a member of the Voyager crew present to be the living witness and contradict the Kyrian and Vaskin versions of history without having to resort to a complicated trope like time travel. All the writers had to do was say, oh, there was a hard drive with a backup of the Doctor, and somehow it wound up on this planet during the battle. Okay then. Works for me. Living Witness was written by Brian Fuller and Brannon Braga and Joe Menosky from a story by Brannon Braga and was directed by Tuvok himself, Tim Russ. I guess that's why, apart from the pervy shared glances with Janeway, Tuvok's not really in this one much. This is the only Star Trek episode directed by Tim Russ. For an episode with 3 credited writers, it doesn't play as clunky or hammered together. Everything works. Everything goes to serve the story and the themes, and, like I said before, those themes could hardly be more important than they are right now. Episodes like this remind us of how important history is, and also of what history is, how malleable and open to interpretation and corruption it is, and why it's important to fight against those who seek to use it against us, or destroy it altogether. Those are my thoughts on Living Witness. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me next week as this Spotlight on Voyager batch continues. Next time, it's an episode from Season 6 and yet another Doctor episode. Maybe I should have called this batch Spotlight on the Doctor. The episode is called Tinker, Tenor, Doctor, Spy. See you next time for that. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.